Yoda, I'm Erin J. Doyle. Welcome to my channel. My plan for Camp NaNo has gone somewhat off the rails. By today I had hoped to have spent a minimum of 10 hours working on poetry. It's been 2 hours in over a week. But never mind. I mean, I wasn't working on these poems at all prior to Camp NaNo, so I've still done stuff, different stuff than what I might otherwise have done, so oh well, we're just gonna ignore the actual goal and be happy with what we have done. So what I did do for the last couple of days, singular hour a day ago I should say, was look at a couple of different poems which have existed in several different forms. It's been one poem, it's been 2 poems, it's been 3 poems, and I've been struggling with what to do with these ideas and how to present them in a way that would be interesting to somebody else. Because the big issue that I have with this particular idea is that it's sort of rooted in relatively specific knowledge. The idea that I originally had was to tell a poem broken up into 3 sections. Each section was referring to a different period of history. I did this using specific labels to tell you that the time periods were there, and then I tried writing it without those time period labels and just the shifts with the perspective. And it was always a little bit weird in some way, and then I had the thought that maybe I'd break it up into 3 poems and write an individual poem for each time period and then maybe present them as a triptych. But no matter how I tried to write these poems, if I changed the perspective, if I added stuff, if I took stuff away, the problem remained that the poem required the reader to have some knowledge of the history of biology, the history of feminism, and a poem from the 1800s and a speech given in the 2000s. That's not necessarily super specific, only one person in the world would know this kind of stuff. I'm sure if I gave the poem to a fellow biologist, female biologist, she would know exactly what I was talking about, she'd be down with the poem. But I suspect that the average reader who doesn't have a degree in biology isn't going to pick up on exactly what I'm talking about with some of the references. So this has always been a barrier to figuring out what to do with this idea. The original plan with this poem was to show the progression of the role of women in science from the 1800s through to today, starting with the Victorian ladies who were not permitted to be scientists, they were not allowed to attend universities, but they were allowed to engage in appropriate hobbies. They were allowed to paint butterflies or grow orchids in glass boxes. They were allowed to observe the night sky. During the same period, a man engaging in the same activities would have been considered a scientist or naturalist or biologist, depending on the exact era and exactly what he was doing. Women were making major scientific discoveries and getting 0 credit because they weren't allowed to be scientists. And quite often their work became known because it was stolen by a male colleague. The idea was to show the progression from this period through to the modern day, with the things that the female scientist is able to do being greater and greater over time, but ultimately still showing the ways in which female scientists are not respected. This was specifically referencing a speech that was given, I want to say about 5 or 6 years ago, in which a renowned scientific figure made a speech in which he said that women should not be allowed in the laboratory because they are a beautiful distraction, because you fall in love with them and they cry when you criticize them. Obviously, total bastard. Many people have tried to defend these claims, saying that it was just a joke and people got their knickers in a knot over nothing and destroyed his reputation for no reason because they couldn't take a joke. But the reality is, if you're a person in a position of authority with a large audience, you're responsible for what you're saying. And you have to think about the consequences of your jokes. So, this poem was written then, and it referenced some of the things which were said in that speech and the ways in which the women in the scientific community protested it at the time. The title of the poem was a combination of ideas. It drew from a poem that was originally published in the 1800s but kind of popularised many decades later, where a man wrote an extremely lengthy poem kind of praising his wife and how lovely she was, and the fragments I have read of that poem are awful. But basically it was describing this ideal woman as being, well, obviously pretty and quiet and submissive and oh so forgiving. And it was called An Angel in the Home, or Angel in the House. My brain's not allowing me to confirm that just at this moment. And when the poem was later kind of popularised, it became this kind of expectation that, you know, the Victorian lady would be the angel in the home. I combined that idea with the woman in the laboratory figure and this idea that she's too distracting and shouldn't be in the laboratory at all. And I titled the poem Angels in the Laboratory or Distracting Angels. I kind of went back and forth, but Angels in the Laboratory is the title that I like the most. The problem is that for that to make sense and for the references within the poem to work, you kind of need a whole bunch of knowledge. So I ended up going through multiple attempts to make this poem clear in some way, to show what I was trying to do with the changes in time period, the changes in what the unnamed women were doing. I tried changing perspective. I had references to different time periods, so I tried having specific dates, and I also had no dates, but then language kind of suggesting changes in time, shifting from referring to people, you know, they were allowed to do this, to you are doing that kind of thing, to kind of show multiple people but also multiple time periods. And it's hard. I mean, it's been hard just to talk about it and describe my idea. So what I've tried to do with working on the poem this month is to take the 3 fragments and put them into one document and try and find a way to make sure that a person without specific knowledge can still understand what I'm saying. And I thought that instead of removing specific references so that that specific knowledge isn't necessary, how many times have I used the word specific? I thought instead I would include outright information. One of the things I thought that I could try was to more directly mimic the original poem An Angel in the Home by taking my words and putting it into the structure of that poem. But when I actually found a copy of it and had a read through, I realised that there's nothing distinct enough in that poem to allow a reader to recognise it even if they were familiar with the original work, so there's really no point in doing that. Another thing that I thought about doing is blatantly stating, you know, so and so in this year said this, and then having the poetry element be a response to that. So I could state what poem I'm responding to rather than just having references to specific words picked out from a very, very old, very, very long poem. Similarly, I could do that with the speech. Say who said what and when, and then have a poetic response to that. However, it took me an hour to come to that conclusion. So I worked on the poem yesterday, did lots of reading of the poem that kind of inspired the title and the speech that kind of inspired the poem to begin with, did some shuffling around, but ultimately, yeah, that poem needs a lot more done to it. I think this is probably going to be my summary for pretty much every poem that I work on this month, just because I am currently working through kind of my folder of garbage poetry that needs a lot of work. So unless I write something brand new, that's probably going to be the summary. Today I started looking at another poem which is in my kind of need some work folder. This poem is kind of suffering a little bit from an attempt to not offend, I guess, because the original kind of kernel, I guess, that this poem has grown from is really potentially quite offensive to a specific person. And I mean, you know, that person can fuck off, but that's not how you kind of play the game when it comes to publishing your poetry publicly. So I've been trying to kind of grow the poem from that original idea and make it into something a little less deliberately poking at a specific person and kind of burying that little nugget of anger or disgust, actually, I think is probably a more accurate term. Trying to hide that little kernel of disgust in a bigger piece and kind of distract from the root idea. That has been a long running project. I wrote the poem in its entirety and I was like, oh my god, chef kiss, this is like perfect, but unpublishable in its current form. So I had my kind of obligatory open it and stare at it and then be sad kind of moment. I think what I've added to it helps my initial how do I not make this just criticism of one person issue, but it doesn't necessarily make it a better poem. So that one's kind of tricky. There is sort of one line, stanza, that I could just cut and that would kind of fix the whole issue in terms of not creating drama in my own life. But oh, the line, it's just like perfect. So I have to make some decisions about that. I think what I should probably do is just delete the poem and stop teasing myself by looking at the thing that academically I know I can't do anything with it. My tea is very cold, but it's also berry, so it can't really go bad. I bought this teacup today because it made me happy. That's everything that I've managed to do this week. It hasn't been my most productive, but you know, I lost several days to sleep and illness, and then the massive amount of travel for field work, which I've talked about in a previous video. So we aren't going to feel bad about, you know, not being super amazingly productive. We have done what we can. I'm going to stop referring to myself as a plural now because it makes me sound insane. On that note, if you enjoyed this video, do give it a like, and if you're new around here, maybe consider hitting subscribe and ringing that bell so you can stay up to date. And if you're doing Camp NaNo, let me know how it's going down in the comments below. See you next time.